Okay, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be here. I love coming back to Beijing. And I want to take advantage of the situation to tell a story over 5 classes. Today is class 1 and we'll have 4 more. It's a new story in some ways, so you won't find this in the textbooks. And many parts of the story I don't know and I don't understand yet. So I need your help. It will become clear as we go along why I need your help. So today we will be talking about something which I call joint speech. You don't know what joint speech is yet? It's not in the textbooks. We have a Chinese translation which is
和声活动.
Okay, so we'll try that. I don't know if it's a good translation. We need to try this out. Okay. I want to start with that because I need your help to find the joint speech in your life. So I will need you to think about your life here in Minda, everyday activities. And there's more joint speech than you might think. It's surprising. I will spend today introducing this to you so you know what I'm talking about. And then tomorrow and Tuesday we reach the big questions about what language is, or I say languaging. So language is a noun, languaging is a verb. That's important. Okay? And then the questions on Wednesday and Thursday next week get bigger still, about the human world, about how we work, live, make sense together, how we coordinate our lives. So today, very focused, and then bigger, and then far too big, and then my head explodes and we finish. Okay? So, I need to define
和声活动.
I apologize, I don't speak Chinese. Please do not let me speak too quickly. I am very happy to stop and explain myself. It is possible that I say something you don't understand. Just put your hand up, no problem, okay? We have all the time in the world. And I'm very happy to answer any questions anytime. Don't wait to the end. Put your hand up, say, what? That's fine. So, these people are all doing joint speech. We'll meet them again, but what they are all doing is saying the same words at the same time. That is very important, that little definition. It's not technical, there's no mathematics. Saying the same words at the same time is very, very simple to think about. But it's going to be very, very useful. And I'm going to extend it more and more. So already, let's start. Saying the same words, well, maybe also singing the same words at the same time. Saying and singing is very similar. You might think songs are music, that's over there. Saying is language, that's over there. You know, music is for fun, language is for thinking. No. So we can use the word utter. To utter just means to make with the voice. So uttering the same words at the same time. That made it a little bit bigger. We could keep doing this. Words, uttering the same word-like things. No, we'll stick with this. Uttering the same words at the same time. Now, why is joint speech not in the textbooks? This is a very interesting question, and we will come back to it later. But for reasons that will become clear, I had to invent this term, and now I'm trying to find a proper Chinese term to use here. So if you don't like the suggestion, we can change that. So this is the introduction to China of joint speech research. There are some words here already in English. The word chant is nice. It works for some of the joint speech we will look at, but not for all of it. In French, chanter means to sing. But in English, chant can be sometimes sung, like when the monks in the monastery sing very solemn music, church music, but also when the football fans go, "Come on, Ireland!" So that's also chanting. And when the protesters go, "We demand the downfall of the government," that's also chanting. So chant means a lot of things, but it doesn't cover everything. Choral speaking will also meet. This is something that children do for their parents or their teachers. It's very nice. It's a kind of a performance. But obviously that's very special. Synchronous speech, that sort of makes sense. Same words, same time. But I made up that term too, because I used to study people in the laboratory speaking together. And we will look at some of that work. But the laboratory is dead. Laboratory is a boring place, and there's no passion in the laboratory. Well, maybe your laboratory, but in my laboratory, there's no passion. So that's only a very specific kind of speech that we can use to ask specific kinds of scientific questions. We could say unison speech. That also means together, but nobody likes that because it's ugly. So we're going to use joint speech. And the thing about joint speech is that when we use that simple definition, same words, same time, that draws our attention to some very interesting and important things that humans do. We don't need a big theory. I try to stay theory-free. You can't be theory-free, but I don't want to be dependent on one theory. I want us to simply look together. And I don't want you to believe anything I say. I want us to see it together so that we can understand things together. When we look for joint speech, and I will be asking you to look for joint speech, we are drawn to the churches and temples and courtrooms where we find people praying, and rituals. We saw some lovely Taoist rituals just 2 days ago, for example. It was beautiful, very complicated joint speech. Very, very complicated. We also find ourselves in the middle of social unrest. So the temples are usually very quiet, but we also find ourselves in the protest marches and the riots when people demand things, when they're unhappy. There they also speak the same words at the same time. And you know, prayer and protest, that's a little bit strange, isn't it? You don't think of those things together. And it gets stranger now. The story begins to get very strange. So the next place we're going to find ourselves is in the football stadium supporting our team. Hey, come on, hey, Beijing, yay, 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 yay. So prayer, protest, football. There are many other places. Those three are the big ones. The next most important one is primary school. How strange is this? Prayer, protest, football, primary school. Joint speech is very much at home in all of these. In every primary school, the children are speaking along. Good morning, teacher. They're doing their tables. 2 times 2 is 4. They're reading their poems aloud, and they're doing choral speaking. There are many more occasions. But the nice thing about joint speech is you do not need a fancy machine to find it. And we can all agree, when we're looking at it, we can typically agree that we're looking together, witnessing some joint speech. For me, science starts with observation. It starts with looking, and preferably with looking together, and not the looking of some expert who's looking at a big machine and complicated mathematics. I don't know to trust him. But here, we can do our science looking together. And we will look then together at rituals, at protest, at all these practices that make our identities. And we will have a lot to say about identities. And Minzu University is an interesting place to talk about this, because the word identity means something very specific here, and I will mean something else. But we'll ask about that relationship. So, I call this an empirical starting point because we already have decided what we're going to look at. What is it we are going to observe? And tomorrow, when we start talking about bigger questions, we will find that the start of any investigation is always to decide what you're going to look at. Then there are more questions. How to look, what to record, what to measure, why, how to theories, modeling, all the rest comes later. The first thing is we have to find a phenomenon. We have to find something we can witness together. So joint speech is peculiar, it's strange, because it picks out these very, very important human practices that build human communities, human societies, and the human world. That all clear? Can I explain anything more? Okay. Now, we're all clear on what we're talking about, so it's going to be very easy now to say, well, what does joint speech look like? It has some very strange features. I'm going to think of joint speech as a kind of language today. Tomorrow, maybe we'll shift that to a verb as a kind of languaging. But for today, we just say, well, this is obviously some kind of language. Well, what kind of language is it? Because it's a bit strange. So the first thing is, speakers and listeners are not separate. Normally when we think of language, don't we think of I say something to you, you say something to me, I'm a speaker, now I'm a listener, ping pong, ping pong, and in joint speech, it's all the same. So that's a bit, that's going to make our discussion of language interesting. The next thing, everybody knows the words. I don't know if you've heard of a chap called Mr. Chomsky. I suppose everybody here has heard of Mr. Noam Chomsky. He made a big, big deal in the middle of the 20th century with his theory of syntax. And at the heart of this was the claim, language is creative. It's generative. We are not parrots. We are not birds simply saying the same things. Well, if you think of language like Mr. Chomsky, then you don't see joint speech. So now we're beginning to see maybe why joint speech is not in any textbooks. Another thing is that usually, not always, but usually, we find the same thing being said again and again and again. Now maybe with little variations, so the children, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, that's a bit varied. But usually the same thing again, whether it's a prayer, Hail Mary, full of grace, Lord is with thee, blessed art thou among women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. I will show you some prayers, and we'll also have some protests. We demand the fall of the regime. We demand the fall of the regime. That's a very bad chant, but it sounds a bit better if I do it in Arabic. Ashab, yurid, iska'atan nizam. Ashab, yurid, iska'atan nizam. That was the big cry of the Arab Spring. Repeated again and again and again. This repetition is very, very important. In the Gospel according to St. Matthew, there is a verse which complains about people who say the same thing again and again. He calls it vain repetitions, as if God said, no, I heard that before. You said that prayer already. Give me a new prayer. But that's not really how things work. People have to repeat things again and again. Performativity is a big word. Sorry. We'll look at it in a minute. It means it's a performance. It means it's something that has to be done so that other people can witness it. I talk a lot about witnessing. We're going to watch together so we understand together. And when we do joint speech, we want someone to witness. We want someone to see or hear. They might not be there, but we still have to do it. And this is the fun thing. Music and speech come together now. There's no difference between them. We will find all kinds of musicality here. Non-musical, very musical, halfways, and that's very interesting. Then, now that we realize we're looking at a kind of language we never thought of before, maybe, we'll see, like the other kind of language has syntax and morphology and phonology. This kind of language also has structure, but it's different. We find call and response. We'll look at that in a minute. And we find a thing I call generalized assent. This is a way for everybody to take part in something complicated. I'll explain those and give you examples in a minute. But most importantly, when people speak together, they are bringing something into being. They are creating something. And this is the kind of identity I'm talking about, not the kind that Minzu administration uses. And I'm going to use the word enactment. To enact means to bring into being by doing. It sounds like something a magic man would do, but just think of this. If we wanted to have a parade, we want to have a parade, you can't have a parade by sitting around thinking about parades. You can't have a parade by writing books about parades. You can't have a parade by making plans. The way to have a parade is to go and march. You have to do the parade, otherwise you don't have a parade. Yeah? So you bring the parade into being by doing. So that's enacting. That's what I mean. So, we're going to step through these and look at examples. The first thing, linguistics, introduction to linguistics class, you learned about a speech chain. I have a mind. I don't. I have a secret mind which I have ideas in, and I encode them into sounds which go through the air and go into your ear, and then you've got a clever brain that makes sense of them, and poof, ideas magically went from my mind to your mind. You're told this on the first day as if this was true. What a fairy story. What a strange story that is. But anyway, that's not going to work for us. Because speakers and listeners are the same, so we don't need any of that. I think it's very strange. The words are known by everybody. Now, this is strange. There are some situations, and we'll see them, where we read the words for joint speech, but almost never. And usually they're so familiar you don't even think of them. So here's a nice ritual. You know, in Ireland, if I talk about a ritual, everybody, maybe it's a bit similar in China, they say, I don't go to church, I don't take part in all that ritual nonsense. This is also a ritual. Do you happy birthday, dear Tommy, happy birthday to you. This is my laboratory. There's Tony Shimero who is visiting. And that's a ritual. If people do this, you join in. You don't stand like this. That would be impolite, right? If they do it in a restaurant, you might even join in and you don't know the person. So it has to be done. And the purpose is to celebrate an individual. It has a purpose in society to celebrate and create an individual, make them special. And the words are, everybody knows the words. It's a very interesting song, incidentally, but we won't have time today. So rituals they're big rituals, obvious rituals, but they're small little rituals, tiny little rituals, and we'll see some of the very small rituals as well. So when I ask you today, and over the next few days, to look for joint speech in your life, sometimes it's hiding in little places like karaoke, for example, happy birthday, unexpected places. And they don't all shout, I'm really important, but they are really important. So the words are known. Now about repetition. Here's a protest. This is a Chinese protest, but we could use anyone. Let's listen. Boom, 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 boom. A simple rhythmic phrase again and again. And we find this everywhere. Here's another Chinese example, but this time it's a Chinese-Indian mixture because it's Hare Krishna's in Beijing. Now you find Hare Krishnas in every big town in the world. You find them in Beijing, you find them in Dublin, you find them in Moscow. It comes from India, but it's not only in India. But this repeating, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, goes on and on and on. This is a practice called kirtan. It's great fun, I recommend it. I love to do it. But it's just repeating the same words again and again. This is in India called a mantra. And mantra opens the door to a whole lot of questions we won't go near today. But you can see the repetition is true in the church and on the street and in the school and in the football stadium. Repetition is usual. Now I want to talk about performativity. I want to show you an unusual example because there's no repetition. People don't know the words, they're reading the words. They say this once only. What's happening here is these people are about to be made citizens of the United States. You find exactly the same thing when someone is made a citizen of Ireland. You have to stand up in public and you have to swear an oath that you will be good, I don't know, Irish, or very American. So this is what it sounds like. Listen to the voice here. Those last few were a bit musical. We had the protest chants, and then we had that nice Hare Krishna, all a little bit musical. There's no music in this.
I hereby declare on oath.
I hereby declare on oath.
That they're just reading, blah, 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 blah. It just sounds like reading. That's unusual, but it's a hallmark. It's a special kind of joint speech used to transform somebody from one state to the next. The philosopher John Austin called this a performative. That is so if you get married, there's a moment in English where they say, I now pronounce you man and wife. Or these days, husband and husband, or wife and wife. It's all different. But that moment when he or she says those words, that's when the change happens. Now you're married, before you were not married. So this is like this. Before this, they were citizens of many countries. After this, they're citizens, in this case, of the USA. Here's more performativity from small children. This is choral speaking. It's for the parents. They're talking about their nose, about how I am discouraged by my nose. The only thing it does, it blows. Listen to that. Blah, 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 blah. Very regular, a little bit musical. Happy birthday, is that music? No, you don't go home and put on your CD of the favorite happy birthday songs. That would be strange. This is sort of music. So we always find in joint speech this sort of music. Now, I want to show you a very special kind of joint speech, also performative. And let me tell you a story. So 3 years ago, I had to go to France to talk about joint speech. I had to go there 3 times in 1 year. And every time I went, the previous week, there was a big terrorist attack with lots of people killed. Charlie Hebdo, Nice, maybe you remember some of these? And I wanted to talk about this particular kind of joint speech which has no words. So joint speech here, taken to the limit, not only does everybody know there are no words, all there is left is participation, because when something terrible happens, we have a minute's silence. Maybe you have that here. And remarkably, when you do this in France after a terrorist atrocity, the whole room gets drawn in. Go play football. When you do this in France after a terrorist attack, you cannot stop the video. Everybody takes part. It seems very strange to call this joint speech when there's no words, no sound. But it, yeah.
But I think that there will be a clue for the football players and fans.
There will be a clue.
There will be a clue, I think. Like before they do this, if somebody would
Oh,
ask.
absolutely. We all say, now we're going to do it. Yeah.
Okay, we definitely, this is a joint speech. Just keep silence.
Just because in joint speech, it turns out, often we don't understand the words. We see examples of this. It doesn't really matter what the words are. What matters is that we take part. And here everybody takes part together. What matters is that you do it together with other people.
But sometimes I think I just realize that I should be keep silence, not the joint speech.
Oh yeah, you know, not every silence is joint speech.
Okay.
Only this silence, this special silence that we do together with common purpose.
My question is, even in this situation, I still understand this is the joint speech.
The silence we have here now, that's not joint.
The silence we have here now, maybe not, but in France it was, because people are taking part. In exactly the same way as if we... So you could do the same thing and we could all say, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh shit, 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 very bad, very bad, very bad, very... There's no point in saying it. There are no words for what this is, but the occasion is one that we do together. If you're quiet on your own, that's not joint speech, of course. No, 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 no.
但是默
But-
哀吧，就是默哀，就是
Uh,
just keep silent, like somebody passed away, then everybody stand and say like, oh now.
If you feel that you're doing it
3
together,
minutes.
if you're all doing it together, now, we don't have to argue. Maybe this is or is not. But when I look at all the different kinds of joint speech, I see this as a limiting case, a special extreme case. But it doesn't matter. Nothing depends. Now, what about that music thing? We've seen lots of, you know, bits of rhythm, bits of melody, no music, very music, a few instruments. Let's look at how different the kinds of music are in joint speech. Here's some football fans. I love these guys. It's great fun. Here's something you often find movement with joint speech. Protesting, praying, this thing. People like to move to joint speech and it's very repetitive, so it suits different kinds of dancing. These are supporters of Manchester City, in case anybody cares. Here's some very different music stuff. This is Gregorian chant. It's a long tradition in the Christian church. Notice no instruments. Sometimes maybe a very quiet one note on the organ. Everybody is not only singing the same words, they're singing the same melody. So there are many kinds of music, and a lot of music is polyphonic, with one voice, sopranos doing one thing, basses doing another thing, fugues, all complicated. Here, there's a special kind of music which is all just one voice. And this is a very big tradition. There are several different chanting traditions like this, and they matter very much to the people who do them. Now, many of you will have heard of a kind of Islam called Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia. It causes all kinds of problems in the world. It gave us, among other things, the problem of the Islamic State. Now, Wahhabists, people who believe in Wahhabi Islam, have a bit of a strange relationship to music. They like to destroy instruments, and they think music is from the devil. That's a terrible approach. But they have chant, because they think this is not music at all. So here's some, this is propaganda from the Islamic State, and it shows two different kinds of joint speech. The first one, which all their propaganda has, it has this chant.
بلغوا منا أبا بكر السلاما
نبايعوا خليفة المسلمين أبو بكر البغدادي أبو بكر.
So there's two kinds of joint speech here. First, the chant. Look how similar that was to the monks, the Christian monks. You know, they say we have nothing in common, but it's no instruments, all voices doing the same thing, very plain, and they don't even think of it as music. And the second one, look how similar that was to these citizens pledging allegiance to their new country. This is called an act of bay'ah, and it's common across many kinds of Islam, not just Wahhabi Islam, but they're pledging allegiance to the Islamic State. So they illustrate nicely that they're not so special. The first kind of chant is very like the Christian chant. The second is very like any legal swearing. So not so special. Now, we said that when we think of language, usually we find syntax, we find grammar, and here we're looking at something very strange, and it has different structures. So one thing it has is this call and response. We've seen it a few times already. In the naturalization ceremony, one person says the words, then everybody else says the words. Here's a little example from a refugee camp in Haiti, where the chap in the middle is just doing wonderful work with these kids. It's a funny thing about joint speech. Okay. I don't speak French. I don't understand the words, but I understand everything that's going on there, and you understand everything that's going on there. It's fun. Yeah? And he's very, very good at it. But this call and response, he does it and they do it, he does it and they do it. Now there is, when a crowd speaks, we often think of it as a mob, you know, we use the words an angry mob. Maybe they're chasing you down the street, maybe they've got pitchforks and torches and they want to kill you. Yeah? If they're coming after you like that, you don't turn around and say, may we discuss things? Could we talk? Crowds have a reputation for being a bit stupid. So you might think that joint speech can only say kind of stupid things. That would be very, very wrong. But the way that you get very careful messages in joint speech is through call and response. So someone has the role of the leader, and then everybody gets to join in. The leader says the really, really important bits, and everybody else gets to join in by saying, Amen. Hell yeah! Okay. Let's have a look. Here's a Christian one.
Be our Lord, bless our congregation. Amen. Guard our assembly. Amen. And make our people glorious. Amen. Which have come and rejoiced in the power of his glorious and holy and life-giving and divine mystery. And with the living side of the cross of our Lord, may you be sealed and guarded from all harm within or open. Now and always and forever and ever. Amen.
So the crowd here is just these two people, but it could also be hundreds or thousands of people. And the only word they have to say is Amen, but they get to take part. This is participatory. They get to take part in the whole thing. So the magic man, the political leader, the priest, says all the careful words, and everybody else gets to join in. And when you have this structure, these texts are kept very, very carefully. So this ritual has been preserved for a long, long time, and we'll see one that's much older, very carefully preserved. So don't think that joint speech cannot be very eloquent. It can say very detailed, important things. So here's a good example of where joint speech can be hiding. So I'm going to show you some preaching by a preacher from a Southern Baptist church from Texas. His name is Marcus Cosby. He is a wonderful preacher. I cannot recommend him highly enough. Lots of videos. But what you're going to see is he's the leader, so he says all the words, but the crowd, listen for where the crowd joins in, and they don't say much. But what you'll see is that they are taking part. It's participation, and it's good fun too.
Now, child of God, this ought to get you happy right here. Because if you don't know anything else about God, you ought to know before you leave this sanctuary today that your God, my God, our God is faithful. That means he's steadfast. That means he's dependable. That means we can count on him. Now, I need 2 or 3 folk in the sanctuary, 2 or 3 folk in the worship center to help me witness to somebody around you who may be on the fence about the faithfulness of our God. I need you to help me testify our God is faithful. If you read Jeremiah's version of Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 22, you'll hear Jeremiah say, it is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, for his compassion fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy... Y'all know something?
I'll stop him there. So you might think he's doing all the talking. He's not. The crowd is going, is giving him this energy back. Yeah, yeah. And if you watch him, he preaches for an hour at a time, and by the end everybody is dancing and shouting together, and it's glorious. So this is a good example of how joint speech can be hiding. That's why I'm very glad to have this time today, so that we can look at many examples, because I need you to find me joint speech in your life. I can't do it. But it can be hiding. It's not always obvious. This generalized assent, amen, is not only found in churches. Political rallies come in many kinds. There is some absolutely terrible politics going on in America right now around the Trump campaign. I presume if you've heard of Chomsky, you've also heard of Trump. I don't even like saying his name. His politics has used an awful lot of joint speech. He holds rallies where everyone goes and they shout, lock her up, build that wall. Really, really stupid chants. And they all just join in. Here's just a short excerpt.
They talk about the elite. The elite. You ever see the elite? They're not elite. You're the elite. You are the elite.
Enough. but you heard them all go, boo, yeah. And then, so this is not joint speech, but it's very, very close. So when we start to talk about joint speech, I don't want to police the boundaries and say this is not. So the silence one is obviously one we could agree or disagree. But there's a lot around here, and applause is one thing that's very, very close by. Spontaneous applause is a way that we all join together performatively to express a common purpose. Laughter sometimes works the same way. Okay, here's another little example of hidden joint speech. These are the Sharp brothers, and they're about to do a juggling show and magic and gymnastics and all kinds of things.
You guys want to see a show? I said, do you want to see a show? All right,
Do you want to see a show? Yes! Now, the moment before people speak that word, they can pretend to be a shopper. I'm just passerby, I'm not concerned. Maybe I'll watch, maybe I won't. When you say yes, you're committed. You are now an audience. Now we have an audience. So that one, these guys are good. This is a technology, a human technology for assembling your tribe, your team, your group. And it's just one word, but it's very effective. So you see where it comes, so it's where it's hiding. Now we come to the most important point. I spoke of the enactment of an identity. So by this, I don't mean an identity like an unchanging attribute of you. Maybe you are Tibetan. Maybe you are Irish. Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an identity as a verb. That's something that you bring into being when you're doing it, and you have many such identities. You are all, some of you are, well, most of you are students, but you're also family members. Some of you may attend churches, some of you may take part in sports, some of you are in various clubs. You all take part in many different kinds of groups. Each of those is a different identity. So don't think of identity as something that you're born with and you carry until you're dead. Don't think that you only have one, or that it's always there. This is identity as a verb. These girls are reciting a Pledge of Allegiance. They are Japanese American girls who have been locked up in a concentration camp in the Second World War. And so it's very important for them to show just how American they are, because they don't want to be associated with Japan, who just bombed Pearl Harbor. That's why they're looking so serious. So enacting an identity is very, very important. Those are monks in a community. There are monasteries in many communities. They're Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, not Islamic, oddly enough, no monasteries there. In all these monasteries, they're very different traditions, but they all chant all the time. Some of them do nothing but chant. So chanting is a means of really gluing people together and bringing into being this collective notion. And there maybe we might think a little bit. This is why, one reason, I'm so delighted to be here in China. From the perspective of Western Europe and America, can we call that the West? It's a bit simplistic, I'm sorry. But it is well known, I think we can all agree, that these are very individualistic societies, where everyone is told, be all that you can be the best, go further. And not everybody in the world thinks like this. People are in communities in very different ways, and I'm very aware in China, society is built differently. Families are different, groups are different, social order is different, right? So when we look at joint speech, we have a way of looking at different forms of collective organization, and maybe we might begin to understand why this is not in the textbooks, because they were written by Europeans and Americans. So that's one reason I'm very delighted to be here, and why I'm going to work with Bei over the next while to write some things in Chinese so that we can think about this together a little bit. These people, this is Cairo, this is the Arab Spring, I think. They are also enacting an identity. They are temporarily protesters. They are against something. You can be for something, you can be against something. Either way, it's very passionate. And it's not always very serious. Sometimes it's just fun, like the footballers. So, enaction means bringing into being by doing, like the parade. So one person, the same person, can be Chinese or Irish, can be Buddhist, or you could be both Chinese and Irish, incidentally. You can also be both Buddhist and Christian. It's not a problem, apparently. The same person could be a Trump supporter, I hope not. Could be a fan of a particular team. Could be a member of that crowd about to watch something going on in the street. Each of these is an identity. One person can have them all in the course of a day. So when I ask you to think a bit about your life and where joint speech is, I'm asking, what are the different temporary groups you belong to? Different temporary identities? And who else is there? And what's going on? Because wherever joint speech happens, something interesting is going on. This is sort of really important. So, there's nothing magic about joint speech as I defined it. It's just people saying the same words. Right? But it directs our attention to some very, very important things. We just use this. Don't think of this as joint speech as being a special kind of speech. Think of joint speech as being your microscope. This is the means by which you find what you want to look at. Then when you find it, then you stand back and say, what's going on? Look at everything around the joint speech. What clothes are people wearing? Where are we? What time of day is it? What are the words? What language are they in? Do people speak that? Who's taking part? We'll go through. We've got lots of questions. What's happening every time people speak together is there's some kind of common ground being established. So we share something in common. Maybe only temporarily, but we are together. Common foundations are being built and a common world is being enacted, brought into being. At a time when sometimes the world is overwhelming. There's wars, change, climate change, there's big, big changes coming to this world. It might be very important to find out how we work together, how we share a world, rather than always looking at our differences. And I don't want to be idealistic. I want to be straightforward and say we can study this. We can understand how we come together. So here's a little drawing that explains, you know, when you study language, usually it's conversation. You know, I talk to you, you talk back to me. You can think of that as being like a back and forth, like two boxers in the ring. And there's the overlap between the two is common ground, and it's always changing. So we start off, we assume some things, and then you say something, and I go, oh, you didn't know that. And then I say something, and you say, oh, yes. And now our joint understanding changes through the conversation. So that's there. Now look at when the preacher was preaching, there's still a little bit of dialogue. The people are saying, yeah, woo, woo, woo. But one person has a bigger role, but there's much more common ground. Everybody is there with a very common purpose. And then there's a special moment in some religions and some legal practices where everybody very carefully says the same words that are very important. In a Christian context, this would be the credo. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, maker of all things, visible and invisible. You're expected to know the words because this is very important. Everybody says it together and there's no back and forth anymore. It's all common ground. So you can see that this is why these are at the center of shared worlds, I think. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Because I have some confused points
Mhm.
about the joint speech. In your words, you think that is let me see, that is a generalized assent.
That's the amen.
Is one sort of joint speech, and also call and response is one sort of joint speech. But in my mind, that is the same. Because that is one person say something and other people have make a response. The difference only is the length of the words. And other question is about the music. Because in my mind, I think in music era they have a word about harmony. And so what's the relationship with the harmony and the joint speech in music?
Wonderful questions, thank you. So the first question, you asked call and response and generalized assent, and isn't that just the same thing?
Yes.
The generalized assent is a form of response. Yes, it is the same thing. But there are other cases where this is much more complicated. So if you go to a Catholic Mass, there are bits that the priest says and bits that the public says. And it's not just amen, but everybody has their role. And this is the way that what we call liturgy is built up. Liturgy is this formal ritual that is preserved in a given tradition over time, where everyone has their part to play. So generalized assent is a call and response, but call and response is much more than that. Okay? As regards music and harmony, yes, you are absolutely right. Harmony is a very important part of music, and we haven't really seen any harmony here, right?
Yes.
I don't want to think of music here and language here. When we look at joint speech, we see everything in between. So we see very speech-like, I hereby declare on oath, and we see a bit of rhythm coming in, boom, 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 and we see some melody with the chanting. Now we can get more musical. We can introduce harmony as next, and polyphony, multiple voices. Now we're moving more into music. We could also move more into language and go into conversation, like this kind of language. So we don't. I'm not trying to talk about one thing. I'm trying to talk about a big landscape. And over here it's clearly speech. Over here it's clearly music. Here's harmony and polyphony. Here's unison. Here's the credo we recite together. Here's the protesters. Here's the swearing of the oath. Here's our conversation in the hall. So it all blends together. So harmony is very important because it tells us, we're over here. And depending on where you are on this continuum, the nature of your participation changes. So over here, right now, you and me are talking. I'm taking you seriously, you're taking me seriously. But we could also disagree. Right? When we get to here, the credo, everything is agreement. It's not very musical, and it means a lot to take part. People will die before they say someone else's creed. This was when one religion invades another religion, they say, you must say our words. And lots of people will rather die than say those words. So this is clearly very, very important. As we add a little bit of rhythm, it gets easier to join in because you've got a beat. Bumpty, bumpty, bump. I don't even know the words, but I can join in. And then as we move towards music, it's easy to join in. We call it dancing, right? And if you're on the disco floor and there's a song and there's words and you're mouthing the words, yeah? Let's say Bob Marley is playing, and you're going, Exodus, I can't think of Bob Marley right now. You're not expected to mean those words. So when Bob Marley he sings his words, he's expressing words for a religion called Rastafarianism. But if you sing Bob Marley's song, you're not expected to be Rastafarian. It's not as, but if you stand up in church and say, I believe in one God, that's kind of serious. So when it gets easier to participate, it costs less. So thank you very much for your question, because this is an important landscape here. From very language-like to very music-like. And it's not two things, it's a continuum. It's one thing. Okay, thank you. Any others? Okay. Tomorrow and Tuesday, we will be thinking a lot about the history of something called humanity. That's a particular kind of monkey with not much hair. They're very clever. Usually, in linguistics, we are interested in message passing, coding, and that kind of activity seems to me to only be very recent. It has to do with writing. Because in linguistics, if you think of a sentence like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, you may have heard of this sentence from Noam Chomsky. It doesn't matter whether it's on the page or whether I speak it. The syntax is abstract, right? But joint speech is not usually written. It's older than writing. It is much older than writing. This is why I think it's very important, because it has played a big role within practices that have made humanity what it is. So I want to look back just a little bit before writing. How do you find chant before writing? It doesn't leave any fossil, it doesn't leave any trace. Joint speech does not normally belong in a page. Most of linguistics has followed the written word, but we don't have to. So I want to show you something very beautiful. That's this piece of rock, of stone. This particular piece is from 1800 years before the Common Era. So we're 2,000 years into the Common. So this piece of rock is 3,800 years old, and it has writing on it. There's a text on it, and we can actually decode the text. This is from what would be today Iraq, Mesopotamia, one of the places in which writing was invented, and in fact the first place in the world in which writing was invented. And this is some of the first writing that was ever invented. Writing started off not writing sentences. It started off counting, and what we do with spreadsheets now. So you have a jar and you make some marks that says who owns it and how much is in it. And then gradually it became something that you could write a text in. So these are the first kinds of writing. It's called cuneiform, and you take a reed and a soft piece of clay and you push it into the clay, and these are syllables, and if there's a very few people in the world can read this, not many, and this is the form in which the very, very first pieces of literature that we can identify as literature are found. This is the very first piece of literature. The first example we have of this text is from 2,600 years before zero, so 4,600 years ago. This is the oldest piece of literature in the world. It's called the Kesh Temple Hymn. There's one other piece that's as old, and it's a collection of wise sayings, like don't steal your neighbor's wife, make sure that you don't let your donkey piss in the well, that kind of thing. Very, very good advice. But this is really, really interesting. We do know the text of this, and we know the language. The language is Sumerian. And these are the words. I don't expect you to read them. Okay? These are the first three words. But listen, this is really important. This text was preserved perfectly for 1,000 years. From 2,600 before the Common Era to 1,600 before the Common Era. So we have many examples of this. A few months ago I went to the British Museum and I actually held one in my hand. It was beautiful, because I love this text. Because when you read this text, you can see it is liturgy. This is a ritual that was done again and again over 1,000 years. And when we read the text, the bit in red comes at the end of every unit. There's 8 of these. And we know this. This is a verse-chorus structure. You know the way you have a song and you sing the verse and then everyone joins in the chorus. Everyone joins in the chorus. So the chorus is joint speech. This is a liturgy with a very carefully preserved text in which we can see everybody joins in the chorus because the red bit is exactly the same at the end of everyone. So we have new words, the princely lord came forth from the house, and the princely lord came, blah, 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 blah. But it always ends, will anyone else bring forth something as great as Kesh? Will any other mother ever give birth to someone as great as Ashti? Who has ever seen anyone as great as its lady Nintur? So they have heroes, everyone has heroes. The important thing is, this shows that long before we had writing, we had liturgy, we had these carefully preserved texts in which there's call and response, everybody joins in at the end. So this is joint speech. And it's much older than writing. So that's kind of interesting. One reason we have rituals goes back a long, long way in history. Rituals are one way that people have always marked very important events. Sometimes these events come around again and again. So harvest, we have a ritual. New Year, we have a ritual. Spring, maybe we have a ritual. Some rituals are not recurrences, but they're transitions. So the baby is born, we have a ritual. You get married, we have a ritual. Rituals bring us into a common time. They allow us to share a time together, especially these recurrences that come around again and again. We often think of time as just, as one guy said, one damn thing after another. That's not very helpful. It's much, much more than that. Time is a way that we are grounded, that we live in the same now. Everybody showed up here at 10 o'clock. Thank you. This is obvious, but it shows that time is much more than just a sequence. Time is all about coming together. So here's the outside of a university, Trinity College in Dublin, in 2014. Now it's 2015. So I don't have to tell you, this was New Year's Eve. That very moment, I know exactly where I was. I was in my house, and my son was having a party. He had all his teenage friends over. They were all getting a little bit drunk and doing things. But they were all having different conversations, as these people were all having different conversations, right up until just before midnight. And I was sitting there, also having a beer, and I just watched as suddenly the whole room came together. I wasn't expecting this. I studied joint speech and I still don't know where it is because it keeps sneaking up and surprising me. Suddenly the whole room came together, everybody stopped the conversations, and they all just started counting 10, 9, 8. And I stood there and I went, wow. This was so important and so obvious. So sometimes the really important things are directly under your nose. Joint speech pulls your attention to the important bits. Now, how could this have been missed? Why is this not in the textbooks? I'm not making it up. I think we have enough examples that we can all agree we've seen some joint speech. Yeah? But just as a psychology talk, we might agree, disagree, and I don't know, memory, attention, I don't know what those, we all saw joint speech. There have been people who've noted this, but they've tended to have different backgrounds to me. So, like Bay, I'm a phonetician originally, and this is how I came to this. It's a long story. I'll tell it tomorrow. Or the next day. Or the next day. It's a very long story. But people with different backgrounds have sort of noticed this. So there's one anthropologist who died, unfortunately, Roy Rappaport, and he got lung cancer and he realized he only had 2 years left to live, So he thought, oh damn, I better write that book I've been meaning to write. And he did. And he got the damn book written before he died. Thank heavens. The book is Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity. Phoneticians don't read this book. Right? Engineers don't read this book. Anthropologists read this book. Religious studies people read this book. So if we go to them, they all know this guy. And he said it is virtually definitive of ritual speech that it is stereotyped, stylized, composed of specific sequences of words that are often archaic, that means very, very old, is repeated under particular, usually well-established circumstances, and great stress is often laid upon its precise enunciation. The exact way that you pronounce it matters. If you are educated in a madrasa in Pakistan, you learn to chant the Quran, and you learn a very specific way of pronouncing each syllable. It's almost like learning a tonal language. And there are very, very precise length distinctions, intonation distinctions. It's not, you don't recite the Quran like you read or speak Arabic. Interestingly, if you are born in Jerusalem as an Orthodox Jew, you are trained to recite, to chant the Torah with a very precise enunciation. Everybody cares exactly what the melody of the speech is, exactly what the timing of the speech is. So here you do Islam, Judaism, they always look more similar. You know, they eat the same food. It's like the Greeks and the Turks. He has spotted how important this is, but he's talking about religion and ritual. I come at this as a linguist, so we reach the same place, but from very different directions. But he points to something that's phonetically important, but he also points to his history. That temple hymn of Kesh we spoke about, it survived for 1,000 years. In that time, the language that was spoken changed, and it changed from Sumerian to a language called Akkadian. I don't know exactly when, but at the beginning, this text is written in the language that everybody speaks. At the end, nobody speaks that language. Everyone goes to school. If you're very literate, you learn that language just so you can take part in the liturgy. That's ancient Mesopotamia 3,000 years ago. We find exactly the same thing in Egypt today. There's a kind of Christianity called Coptic Christianity, and they use a language called Coptic. And it only exists in the rituals. It used to be spoken, but now it only exists in the rituals. In Israel, everyone speaks Hebrew. They didn't used to. Israel was set up in 1948, 1949, I forget which. Hebrew was a dead language before that. People did not speak it in their daily life, but they used it for their rituals. So it was preserved as a ritual language and then brought back to life with the founding of the State of Israel. We just mentioned the switch from Sumerian to Akkadian. In Ethiopia today, the most common language is Amharic, but there is a very similar language, an older language called Ge'ez, and that's used in the rituals only. So we find this all over the place in these traditions, religious traditions, that the joint speech or the structures around joint speech are very carefully preserved, like a museum piece, even if people don't understand what they're saying. In Ireland, when I was very young, Mass was said in Latin. Most people didn't speak Latin, so it was the same kind of thing. This is quite common, therefore, in religious rites. But maybe we see the same, as usual with joint speech, maybe we see the same thing in other places. Does anybody here ever mouth the words to English pop songs that they don't understand? I think over the whole world people do this. It was great fun when in Korea there was this song called Gangnam Style by Psy. It was in Korean, and suddenly all the English kids are mouthing Korean words they don't understand. It was an interesting reversal. Hooray for Psy. In Hong Kong at the moment there are protests going on, and The protesters have been described by Chinese state media as rioters, and in response, there is now a signature chant of the protests, which is an English Anglican hymn, Sing Hallelujah to the Lord. So now there are t-shirts printed with Sing Hallelujah to the Lord. So again, we have a language from outside. In Hong Kong, it's only kind of outside, right? This was a British colony for a long time. But it's not Chinese. But it has become the language of the thing. Now, I don't want to get into this too much because it's a very active situation. But it's very interesting that we find the same linguistic fact, that there's an external language, or a language that's not everybody's language, being used in this formal joint speech practice. And then, of course, there's my friend, happy birthday. In China, I think you sometimes sing this with the English words, you sometimes sing it with the Chinese words. Is that right? Why? Because that's what we do, we humans, right? We, in rituals, we don't mind really if we understand the words. What we mind is that we take part. That's, coming back to the silence, that's really why I say it's not too important what the words are, or even the absence of words. Just from looking at everything else, there's something going on here. Now, oh yeah, so this also tells us that this notion of identity is very, very complicated. Identity is not just being associated with a language and a place and some funny costumes and some interesting dishes, right? That's a very, very poor way of understanding who we are, how we come together. The word culture is often used just to stop talking about all this interesting stuff, because this is difficult. When we talk, we are complicated people. We have complicated lives. We come from complicated families with complicated relationships. It's not fair to us to describe us in one dimension. We are networked. We are social. We are all kinds of things. And when we look at the language, we see this. Now, joint speech is not difficult to study. Well, is it? It's everywhere. We can find lots of it. The next thing to do is to ask, well, what are the questions we want to ask of joint speech? So the start of any scientific work is to observe, to find something that needs to be understood. The next question is the next business is to form a question. Joint speech is confusing because there's many different ways we can do this. I have done research here in phonetics, in movement science, in social science, social psychology, in neuroscience. You can do all this, and there's lots to see. So I want everyone to help me and they and everyone to develop the questions. That's why I'm going to be asking for your help. I want to develop the questions. Here's a different form of language. It's not joint speech. It's glossolalia. Anybody know what glossolalia is? You've never had the Holy Spirit come down and then you start speaking in tongues. I can't do it. That's glossolalia, speaking in tongues. It belongs to a particular kind of Christian Pentecostal tradition. I think it occurs in a few religious traditions, but I always associate it with Pentecostals. Here's the people doing it, speaking in tongues. So how many of you have ever spoken in tongues? Nobody. How many of you have ever taken part in joint speech? Everybody. If you look at the scientific literature, there's more than 10 times as much work on glossolalia as there is on joint speech. Why? Because it's very easy to say what the question is here. So here's a question. Those sounds they're making, is that really a language? Well, that's a very easy one to test. The answer is no. Surprise! It's not Jesus' language, it's not the first language, it's not a language at all, it's just made syllables. Then you can ask, well, the obvious questions, are they all crazy? Answer is no, and then there's lots more questions. But it's very much a minority kind of thing. No, not many people do it. Well, lots of people do this, but not everybody does this. But it's very easy to ask the questions in this area. So I'm developing questions in the area of joint speech. I need your help. Right? How are we going to do this? You all got a piece of paper here. And on the front of it, did you translate this, Bain?
No, I didn't.
We didn't translate
We
it.
didn't, yeah.
If anyone needs help reading this, come to anyone, I think. This summarizes, goes over a lot of what we've talked about today. And it suggests some of the kind of questions you might ask. So if you spot an instance of joint speech, here's some examples I know that I didn't know, I know now that I didn't know 2 days ago. In Minzu, when the student clubs are recruiting members at the start, they announce the club jointly. They sing its virtues or chant its virtues. I did not know that. So that's joint speech in Minzu. I would have lots more questions. I don't just want to identify it, having found it. Now I want to ask some questions about it. Here's another one. There are some businesses around here, like hairdressers, where at the start of the day, people working together will come out and they will chant together some kind of joint encouragement. Is that okay?
Yes,
Yeah?
that's right.
And these are people on the same level. So it's not a big boss of Alibaba saying, you must do this, because that would be really weird. These are people who, solidarity, they're expressing some kind of solidarity. I did not know that. Now I've got lots of questions. So when I find something like this, then I have to ask myself, I have to open my eyes, open my ears, and try to find out what's important, and anything can be important. Remember, joint speech was just a microscope. Now you have to look through the microscope and see what you see. So, we could ask, where is it happening? Is it in a room? Is it in a temple? Is it on the street? Is it on top of a building? On the bottom of a building? Underwater? I've never heard of joint speech in this. What is the occasion? What time of day is it? Is this predictable? So the student clubs organize at the same time of the year, start of the semester, every year. So that's totally predictable. Protests in Hong Kong, not so predictable. Has this happened before? So very many cases where we have joint speech, it happens again and again and again. Maybe every Sunday, maybe every semester, maybe every New Year. Sometimes it's entirely spontaneous. So, do you want to see a show? Yes! I don't know when that's going to happen again, it's just the next time someone feels like saying that. So that's not regular, it's not repeated. So those are all interesting kinds of things. Now, who's taking part? How many people? Is this 2 people? That can be joint speech. There's no such thing as one person joint speech. You need at least 2 people. But maybe there's 1,000 or 2 million. What language are they speaking? We won't assume it's Chinese. Actually, Minzu is very interesting because there are many languages here, right? Sometimes people take part in joint speech even if it's not their language. And it really matters what language is being spoken. So these are very interesting questions. Now, there is a way of describing identity in Minzu that has to do with where you're from. Are you Miao? Are you Nashi? Are you Tibetan? Are you Uyghur? Are you Han? This is not the question I'm asking, but I would like to know what are those labels? If there's a whole bunch of Tibetans and Uyghurs together singing Happy Birthday in English, well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Do the people know each other? Sometimes people are very familiar with each other. Sometimes it's just strangers, just with common purpose. Is anybody there not speaking? So we've seen joint speech is sometimes in complicated situations. Maybe are there security, administration, Officials, police, looking at this? Or is everybody joining in? Happy birthday to you. Come on, join in. Maybe it's like that. How old are people? Children do joint speech a lot. I've spoken about classrooms, but don't think joint speech is always very happy or positive. This is how children bully each other as well. In the playground, if you get a circle of children around one child and they all go, nah, 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 that's not nice. It's like, we've seen it with the Trump rallies. This is sometimes horrible. Yes, joint speech is found in Nazi Germany, in North Korea. It's not always good. It can be a means of intimidating or bullying. Is everybody a student? That's one kind of identity. Are older people present? Are there particular uniforms or costumes? So we went to this Taoist ceremony, and boy howdy, yes, there were costumes. There were very, very elaborate, gorgeous costumes that were involved. They were very important. Then I want to know is how musical is this? Are there instruments? Is there a beat? Is there just a regular beat? Is there repetition? Are there gestures? Are people doing this? Or this? Or this? It's all important. Are people standing? Or are they sitting? Is there a call and response? So I said sometimes joint speech is hidden because it's just a response, and this call is very complicated. Is that going on? Then the words. What are the words? The actual words. What are they? Does everybody know them? Are they written down? Are some people reading them? Does everybody understand them? You see, it's not always the case that everybody understands the words. And then, because you're all very different, I want to know, who are you that's telling me this? How would you describe yourself? Maybe you don't want to describe yourself, that's okay. But I would like to know, because each of you is, each of you is, for me, a resource. You are all very valuable to me. But you are all very different. Each of you sees different things. So this is probably the weirdest science project ever. You are now all promoted to scientists. You have a sheet here, and it has space for writing down. So one sheet for one instance of joint speech, but there's lots of white space, and I haven't tried to tell you what to report. I've now given you many, many examples. So when, where, why, who, what kind of joint speech, the words, and your role. All of these might be important. What time of day is it? Is it rain? I just cannot predict what's going to be important, because joint speech creeps up on me from behind and gets me and goes, ha! You didn't think of this. It happens to me. I've been doing joint speech research now for maybe 10 years, and it happens again and again and again. It still happens today. So, I'm afraid with your new job as scientists comes new responsibility. You have to decide what's important. So you have to open those eyes, open those ears, and please tell me. Now, we will make available many more of these sheets. Can we make that?
Yes.
We have lots more here.
Yes. Also,
I hope some of you will come back to the other classes, so we meet tomorrow, and Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday next week. Anytime you can bring these, we will always have more here, okay?
Yes,
we
we have
keep a big stock. Any report you can give me will be so valuable, and I do not know what the result of this will be.